With me today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, SNP MP Hannah Bardell, the Daily Mail's Deputy Political Editor John Stevens and the Chief Political Correspondent for The Guardian, Jessica Elgot. Today, the government denies the Prime Minister misled MPs about parties in Downing Street. It comes after Dominic Cummings accuses Boris Johnson of lying to Parliament.
In principle, if a minister lies to Parliament and fails to correct it, should they resign?
Yes.
Also on the programme, the government wanted new powers to deal with protests like this, but the plans are defeated in the Lords. So what will ministers do next?
It's now the proportionate and the responsible thing to move to Plan B in England.
I'm asking people to reduce their contacts with those in other households as much as possible.
Who got it right over COVID restrictions, and will they soon be coming to an end? And is it OK for governments to ask teenagers about their sex lives? We speak to a campaigner who says those conversations are important. Let's start with the stories covered in the Sun newspaper, amongst others, with the headline, Dominic Cummings, this is, Prime Minister lied on Number 10 party, followed by the headline in The Guardian, which is very similar, Cummings accuses Prime Minister of lying over Number 10 party. You will know that this is referring to the party on the 20th of May at Number 10 in the Number 10 garden during lockdown in 2020. And the former chief advisor to the Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, says he'll swear under oath that the Prime Minister was warned about that event and that Boris Johnson lied to MPs about lockdown parties. Number 10 says it's untrue that Boris Johnson was warned about it. The Prime Minister says he attended the garden drinks, believing it to be a work event. Miriam, who do you believe?
Well, I don't think that's clear yet. I think Number 10 have said one thing, Dominic Cummings has said the other. It's clear there's no love lost between Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister. I'm not sure he's the most reliable witness. But on the other hand, we do have an independent inquiry, and that's why we're waiting for the inquiry to establish the facts so that those kind of things can be found out. So
when you say it's not clear, you're not absolutely sure Boris Johnson is telling the truth?
Well, I wasn't at the party. I wasn't invited to the party. I've never worked in Number 10. So I don't know what's happened. And that is why we've got the inquiry. That's why it's ongoing. But I think, I am angry and disappointed about what's happened. I think it speaks to a disconnect between what happens in Number 10 and Whitehall and how ordinary people have experienced lockdown and experienced those restrictions. So I think it's very clear that something quite fundamental needs to change. But as for the actual details of what's happened, I don't know that, and that's why there's going to be an inquiry.
Who do you believe, Hannah? Two versions of events, one from Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor, and one from Number 10.
I think it's very clear that the Prime Minister is incapable of telling the truth. He has consistently lied, and it's pretty powerful testimony that Dominic Cummings is willing to go on oath and that he claims his version of events are corroborated. And I think that is incredibly powerful. But I think what's really important is that the Prime Minister has admitted that these events happened. And, fair play to Miriam for coming on and actually expressing a view, although she hasn't expressed a view on who she believes or, what has actually happened. But, the Prime Minister has undermined his own rules and regulations and laws. And Sue Gray has to have all the facts. So if she is unable to access the testimony of Dominic Cummings and everybody involved, that investigation won't be worth the paper it's written on.
Right.
And that is why we have called for an independent, judge-led investigation. And on top of all of this, the police have a role in this. The Metropolitan Police have a role in all of this. And they are totally shirking their responsibilities, undermining their own credibility and undermining their own police officers.
So you're placing your trust in Dominic Cummings, the man who made the infamous trip to Barnard Castle during lockdown?
Well, I think what he did as an individual, which was completely outrageous...
No, absolutely, but you believe him?
I'm taking it at face value, and I believe that he should be given the opportunity to give testimony to Sue Gray, and also that the police should investigate, and there should be an independent judge-led inquiry. Because as Miriam's rightly said, there is something very rotten at the core of this government and this establishment.
Jessica, is Dominic Cummings out to get the Prime Minister?
I mean, yes, he clearly is out to get the Prime Minister. I saw someone comment on Twitter yesterday that it seems like he set up a war room in his living room to feed these responses, these revelations, which do more and more damage to the Prime Minister every time. I mean, there has been moments, many times actually, where Dominic Cummings has kind of overpromised to reveal this damning evidence and hasn't actually delivered it. He promised to do so over Matt Hancock, and that evidence was apparently never given to the select committee that was investigating at the time. And he, claims that there are other senior officials who'll corroborate it. Now, I've spoken to people inside Number 10, one of whom said that they did raise concerns within the building. Whether that's with the Prime Minister directly is less clear. But this, it seems pretty straightforward for Sue Gray to look into. Cummings claims that there was an email sent by another senior official, and claimed that and he also claims that there are eyewitnesses who saw him tell Martin Reynolds, the senior official who sent the invite to the party, that it was a bad idea. He claims he also raised it with the PM himself. I mean, it seems fairly clear, the choreography, and if Sue Gray can corroborate it, it feels like that means it's quite evident that the Prime Minister did mislead the House of Commons, which is very serious.
Right, we'll come on to that in just a moment. John, what impact is Dominic Cummings stepping into the fray in the way that Jess has just outlined on Tory MPs? Is there any evidence to show that they're actually uniting, or it is actually resulting in them uniting behind Boris Johnson?
Well, I think a lot of Tory MPs are quite worried about this, and I think the key thing on whether this becomes a terminal problem for the PM is whether there's any evidence for the things that Dominic Cummings has said. So he said that he verbally warned the PM that this was a party, but he didn't say that he'd emailed the Prime Minister himself to warn him. And so I think at the moment it's a he said, she said. I don't think that is necessarily going to lead to the downfall of the Prime Minister. But if Sue Gray finds an email that was sent to the Prime Minister, or a WhatsApp message or a text message saying to the Prime Minister, this is happening, I think that's a bad idea. But I think the thing that Tory MPs are also worried about from that Dominic Cummings blog is the last couple of lines, where he said there are more photos of parties to come out. You'll hear more from me after the Sue Gray report. And Tory MPs are obviously hoping that everything will come out when this report is done, the Prime Minister will respond, and this will be the issue done and dusted, and we can move on. But obviously, if there's a threat of more things coming out, that will worry Tory MPs that Boris Johnson's never going to be able to move on from this successfully. Right.
Dominic Raab was interviewed, the Justice Secretary, earlier, Miriam, and has said a Prime Minister found to have deliberately lied to Parliament would normally resign. Do you agree with him? You heard him there in the headlines.
Well, that is the normal procedure, but as I said, that's why we're waiting for the facts all to be established in this inquiry. And I think, we need to go back to the big picture here. This is, of course, mistakes have been made. The Prime Minister has been very clear about that. This isn't the end of it. There's going to be the investigation, and then he's going to make a statement. And I think what happens next is the key issue. If he is to continue, how are we going to change this culture so that we get back to a kind of understanding of how normal people live their lives, which has been potentially the problem throughout COVID?
Well, let's talk about one of the things that could happen next. This tweet by Eleanor Langford from the House magazine. It's an interview with Jeremy Hunt, former Health Secretary. He has said that while his ambition hasn't completely vanished when it comes to running for Conservative Party leader, it would take a lot to persuade me to put my hat into the ring. How do you read that, John?
Well, it's not very subtle, is it? It's a kind of, here I am, don't forget about me, remember I last time. And I think you're obviously seeing lots of potential candidates raising their profile. I mean, I'm surprised Miriam's here, that she's not been too busy with Fizz with Liz and Breakfast with Rishi, that all our other colleagues seem to have filling their diaries at the moment. I think there's a lot of people jostling. I think they're all being quite careful not to be shown to be too disloyal, which obviously won't go down well with Tory members.
Have you been courted by any of the potential leadership candidates if there were to be a contest?
No, I haven't. I've clearly missed out on these occasions.
All right, well, let's move on and talk about the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. This is the story, BBC News. Crime Bill, Lords defeats for government's protest clampdown plans. This is a major piece of proposed legislation, but clauses designed to control protests, like the sort you can see here, have proved very controversial. Ministers had wanted to bring in new restrictions in response to protests by Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain. You'll remember we covered these stories at the time. I think that's the slip road on the M25, and you can see all the traffic and congestion that it causes there. Jess, can you tell us what happened in the House of Lords last night?
Yes, it went on until the early hours of the morning, and as you say, Jo, the House of Lords inflicted a serious number of defeats on the government, 14, I think, on these new laws that clamp down on these disruptive protests, as the government would have it. It does other things as well, but that's the main controversy around it. One of the powers that was rejected by peers would see police be able to stop and search anyone at a protest without suspicion. For items used to prevent a person being moved, i.e. to sort of lock them onto things. Another one that was defeated was against this introduction of serious disruption prevention orders personally against protesters who the police suspect, and also these proposals to give police new powers to stop entirely noisy and disruptive protests in England and Wales, which many of people have sort of said tend to be the point of protest. And there were amendments too, including amendments the government has previously rejected, including making misogyny a hate crime. That was one that came to the fore after the murder of Sarah Everard that does have support from quite a number of MPs.
Okay.
And so, I mean, there is disquiet about this in the Commons too. It'll come back to the Commons. There's some libertarian Tories who don't like these rules, but the government seems pretty determined to try and push them through again.
I mean, Miriam, should the police be allowed to stop a protest if they think it's too noisy?
Well, I think that's a very kind of simplistic way of putting at it. Of course,
well, it is what it says over disruptive and noisy protesters.
Of course, noisy protests themselves should not be banned. As just said, that is part of the point of protest. But there is a point at which the noise can tip over into actually disrupting people's ability to carry on with their work, can cause, quite a lot of distress if it continues for longer. And I think, one of the points that's been made is that since the last time any changes were made to these kind of Public Orders Act, there's been some very big increases in technology around amplification, how cheap it is for people to carry the kind of technology that amplifies noise quite intensely. I mean, I was working in my office just before Christmas. There was a protest. It wasn't a big protest, but the noise was intense enough that I couldn't work and I had to move to another room. Now, of course, that's a minor disruption. But if that's going on outside your office day in, day out, and it's driving you mad, then I do think that is impinging on people's rights to carry out their lives. So there has to be a balance here.
Right. Do you agree, Hannah?
No, I don't. I mean, protest is a very important cornerstone of democracy. And, the government is doing this, trying to do this at the same time as it's putting forward legislation to suppress voters being able to exercise their right to vote. 2 million people are going to be locked out of voting because of the elections bill last night.
But on this particular issue, Hannah, what's wrong with what Miriam's just said?
Well, what they're trying to stop people doing is exactly the kind of things that the suffragettes did. To make sure that women got the vote. So, I'm sorry, but I just think it is a government who is right-wing and extreme and trying to suppress any kind of opposition, which is fundamentally wrong. And, they were also very stupid. They brought some of these amendments to the Lords. And, I do not believe in an unelected upper chamber. I believe that the Lords should be abolished and it should be an elected chamber. Nonetheless, fair play to them. They did their job last night and discharged their duty and stopped this illiberal piece of legislation or aspects of it. And those amendments can now not go back to the Commons, which I think is a good thing. But to stop people, and also one of the aspects of this legislation was they would prevent people from going to future protests. That's an outrageous way for any government to behave.
Right-wing and extreme.
Well, I think that's a strange way of portraying it, because if we look back over the last 2 years, some of the actions of the protesters have been very extreme. I mean, stopping ambulances from going to hospital, disrupting the free press, gluing yourself to a train so people who need to get to work to feed their children can't. That's pretty extreme.
Let's just show people an example of that, because, yes, in recent months, people have been gluing themselves to the road or chaining themselves to building. It is called locking on. And I think in the pictures that we can see, you'll see one of the protesters actually gluing their hand to a police vehicle. It can prove hugely disruptive and costly, as it involves specialist police teams being diverted to remove people safely. Why shouldn't that be an offence specifically, Hannah?
Well, I think we need to think about what people are protesting about. And a lot of people have been protesting. A lot of these protests have been about the environment. And we face a climate crisis. So instead of, targeting protesters who, many of whom have very legitimate concerns that almost every government in the Western world recognises, we should be looking at ways that we can stop that climate crisis. And, perhaps then people wouldn't need to go to such extreme measures.
I mean, how else do you persuade governments to change course unless you protest very visibly, John?
You protest visibly, but there are limits. And I mean, to go back to Hannah's point, clearly the suffragettes weren't banging out music very loudly through speakers, and that's what we're talking about here. Fine, but that's a different issue. And I think, when we're talking about commuters who weren't able to go to work, we saw those pictures of people queued up at the Blackwall Tunnel, people trying to visit loved ones in hospitals. And you ended up with members of the public having to get out of their cars and trying to drag these people out the roads themselves because the police weren't able to do things. And, people say that the police have got the powers to deal with this. But last time around, the government had to get all these injunctions all through the country. And, they're having to arrest people twice because if someone got arrested once, they could claim they weren't aware of the injunction. So then the police would have to go back and arrest them a second time.
Right. Well, is that the point there, Jessica, that the government have had to seek injunctions? It's a sort of temporary measure to remove some of these protesters and that this would put it on a more permanent footing?
I mean, I think there certainly is a question mark about whether the police have, do have the requisite powers already to remove these people. And I do think there's also probably a question that for some of the protesters, like in Insulate Britain, about whether some of the tactics they've used really do, sort of bring people along board with a message that's incredibly important. But those kinds of disruptive protests is essentially meant to be disruptive. It's meant to make people notice what you're doing, and insulation as a topic that started off being quite unsexy has certainly been on the lips of more people, questioning government ministers about what they're doing to stop climate change. And so in that sense, they've achieved their goal. But, there is probably questions for the protesters themselves about, when you've got people in deep distress on television, saying how they're missing going to see their elderly mother, in her dying moments, then it's a question for them about whether they think their tactics should adapt to that as well.
Right. Isn't there something really ironic that the police want more powers to arrest protesters, yet when the government have admitted to breaking the rules over COVID, they seem completely limp and unable to do anything?
Right, well, let's hear what Baroness Williams of Trafford, the government minister, had to say about it last night.
My lords, these are people taking their children to school, going shopping, visiting loved ones in hospital, going to Heathrow on their holidays, indeed trying to get to the hospitals that they work in. My lords, I live mostly in the north of England, and honestly, this House should look at themselves. This is about the arguments deployed here tonight are about the middle classes trying to stop working people from going to work. And I know where I stand on this, my lord.
What was your reaction? Well, I could see it there. Sharp intake of breath, Hannah.
Yeah, I think that's a very cynical and dangerous line of argument. Protest is for everyone, government is for everyone, and politics should be for everyone. So trying to characterise it like that. Climate change will affect everyone. It won't just affect certain people, but it will also affect poorer people disproportionately. And I just think that is a very one-dimensional view and doesn't give the broader picture.
Miriam?
No one is saying that there shouldn't be a right to protest. Of course there should in a democracy. It's really important. The question is about the balance of rights. Has the pendulum swung too far in favour of the protesters being able to disrupt ordinary people's lives to an unacceptable level? Yes, it has. That's why this legislation was attempted to be brought in.
But is it only middle-class people who protest in the way Baroness Williams said?
No, I'm sure it isn't only middle-class people, but I think what her point was that often the effects of these protests fall much more heavily on poorer and working-class people. If you can't get to work, let's say, to a job that you can't do from home, and if you don't get paid if you don't get to work, then you can't feed your family. If you can work from home from your laptop in a house with a nice garden, and you can't get to work that day because someone's shut the motorway, well, you can cope. So I do think that
that's
these
not
protests...
the fault of the protesters, though.
No,
that's the fault of the government who's making people poorer and driving people into greater poverty.
That is a whole other debate.
It is, but the two are linked and you can't look at them in a vacuum.
The point is that often the impact of these protests, when they do become unreasonable, nobody's objecting to reasonable protests, fall much more heavily on the poor and on people who actually need to get to work and need to get about their daily lives.
Is that right?
I'm not sure that that's the case. I mean, I don't have any data to back that up, so I don't want to speak absolutely, but I think that's a very cynical view. And like I say, when people face those challenges, those are structural and institutional challenges, and to suggest that protesters who, you know, and we can have absolutely a debate, as Jessica says, about whether the means justifies the ends, but perhaps the government needs to wake up to some of those issues and actually tackle those issues rather than trying to criminalise and target protesters.
But I also think we need to wake up in Parliament and in London perhaps to the way that people in the wider country have reacted to these protests, which they've seen that they think enough is enough. And, you know, I think Jess made the point about winning hearts and minds. If you are stopping people from going about their daily lives, visiting ill relatives, are you really winning people over to your cause, or are you actually hardening opinion?
Right, but there is this issue of competing rights. It isn't straightforward, is it, John? And actually, arguably, I mean, the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, said he thought the Lord's defeats on some of these key issues need to be reversed. But aren't peers, including some Tory peers, telling the government to think again?
Yeah, and I think you will see the government bring some of this stuff back. Some of it they are able to bring back straight away, and some of it has to fall away, and they might have to bring back a separate bill. But you've seen the reaction from people like Priti Patel this morning. She was quite strong on Twitter, blaming Labour for this. And I think it does feed into, you know, the Tories wanting to make this a Tory versus Labour thing. But going back to whether the ends justify the means, but the means justify the ends, it's that I'm just not sure this tactic works of these extreme protests, because I think there is an argument for having to invest in insulation, but the government's not going to do that if it looks like it's been held to ransom by extreme protesters. If, you know, the government has protesters close down motorways, shut down train lines, and then gives in and does this, then that will lead to more people doing similar things. So that's why I think rather than protesters getting what they want, they're getting the opposite, because ministers are having to be quite hard and saying no to these things that actually there is an argument for doing.
Right, well, Jessica, what do you think of John's comments, bearing in mind you feel that actually these protests have helped push the green agenda to the very top of ministers' in trays?
Yeah, we ran some pieces with a think tank just before Christmas, particularly around COP, where we're looking at kind of public reactions to it, both in focus groups and in polling. And it's extraordinary to see how much this issue has become, you know, particularly climate change, but also actually issues like insulation, that were barely anyone had taken any interest in it before, had become words on people's lips, that it was you know, more widely expressed that the government ought to do something about insulating people's homes. I mean, I think there's a question about how much, particularly post-pandemic, people expect the government to do really big interventions on these issues, which was a thread that ran throughout lots of the research that we looked at. But, you know, I do actually think that this is a topic that is becoming higher on people's agendas. I think we're probably also likely to see a bit of a pushback from Tory MPs on the net zero campaign. And I do wonder whether that is actually slightly out of lockstep with where public opinion is moving.
John?
I mean, words on people's lips is not the same as action, and that's what these protesters want, and it's what they're not getting at the moment.
Right. I mean, a new bill being introduced later this year to try and deal with some of the defeats in the House of Lords, Miriam, it will delay it. I mean, do you back the idea of a new bill being introduced specifically to reverse some of these amendments?
Well, I think the government's been clear that we don't know what we're going to do in response. I mean, I think the voting didn't finish till after 1 a.m. last night. So it's very early days in terms of what the government's response is. So, you know, I don't know on that yet. I think it's too early to say.
And just briefly, Hannah, the bill doesn't apply to Scotland. It covers England and Wales. By convention, the SNP don't vote on issues that don't directly affect Scotland, yet you and your colleagues voted against this bill at second reading. Why?
Because aspects of it do. So if you know, we're still in the position that Scotland is part of the Union. It is not an independent country yet, sadly. And laws that are being made at Westminster apply and affect Scotland, and particularly on protest. We want people to be able to come and protest at Westminster. That's an incredibly important part of the functioning of democracy. And any curb on that, we find is the particular curbs and the particular aspects of this bill completely inappropriate. But there's an interesting point. I mean, the discussion about bringing back a new bill and what might happen. I found out recently that the government had stopped members of the House of Lords being able to vote remotely and electronically because they were losing at every turn. So, you know, now members of the House of Lords, whatever your opinion may be on that, have to come in and vote electronically. And I think that's an interesting point, that the government UK government, Conservative government, is doing everything it can to curb democracy and participation. And I have no doubt whatever bill is brought forward, they'll try and do the same again.
Miriam, you want to respond?
Well, I think trying to bring everybody back into Parliament, to participate in Parliament, is actually very much in favour of democracy, and, you know, I support that.
All right, we're going to talk about COVID restrictions in just a moment. But first of all, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has been commenting, or asked certainly, about Partygate. You will remember he wasn't in the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions last week because he had a well-timed event that took him to a different part of the country. But let's just hear what Rishi Sunak had to say.
If the Prime Minister lied and lied to Parliament, he should resign, shouldn't he?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. The ministerial code is clear on these matters. But as you know, Sue Gray is conducting an inquiry into the situation. I think it's right that we allow her to conclude that job.
How difficult is it going to be, just briefly, John, for that line? And while we wait for this report from Sue Gray, which may not happen until the very end of this week or possibly into next week, that's going to be the question, isn't it, continually to ministers?
Yeah, and I think you've seen very different strategies from both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, who are seen as potential successors to Boris Johnson. Liz Truss has been out on the broadcast a couple of times, and she's 100% supportive of the PM. Rishi Sunak, that is much more mealy-mouthed. It's not quite the same full backing.
All right, let's have a look at this headline. I said we would talk about restrictions. The headline is "Curbs Must Be Omicron." Great headline.